Last May, CNN reporter Wolf Blitzer stood with a young mother in Moore, Oklahoma, the rubble of what had once been her house behind them. The mother was holding her 19-month-old son and was sharing the story of how her family had just barely escaped harm in the devastating tornado that had destroyed much of her town the day before. As her child played with Blitzer's microphone, the reporter sought to wrap up the live segment in which they had discussed the good fortune the family had to escape the storm. "You guys did a great job," he said. "I guess you've got to thank the Lord, right? Do you thank the Lord for that split-second decision?" he asked. The mother, her child squirming in her arms, stuttered her response. I, before cocking her head to the side and admitting, "I'm actually an atheist." Then she laughed deeply, maybe out of relief for speaking her truth, maybe out of the absurdity of admitting to the CNN audience something that she might not admit too boldly among her neighbors. Blitzer laughed too. "Oh, you are," he said. "Well, all right." More laughter between them. "We are here," she continued, "and you know, I don't blame anybody for thanking the Lord." After what she and her neighbors had been through, the terror, the devastation of nature's fury, some would call it God's fury, this young mother didn't shy away from her truth, and yet she left room for the truth of others. Acknowledging both last month's theme here at the church and this month's, I must tell you, I felt kinship with her in that moment, and I was in awe of her grace under pressure. I try to imagine what I would have said, Wolf Blitzer standing beside me, my 19-month-old child in my hands, the rubble of what was once my house behind me. "Do you thank the Lord, Mark? Do you thank the Lord?" You know, Lord is one of those words that kind of flips a trigger in me. Maybe it does for you too. It implies to me a puppet string pulling God who sits on a throne, who saves and destroys by design, even by whim. I suppose this Lord is possible, but since I don't have proof that we are being controlled by a supernatural being with a penchant for mayhem, this kind of God is not the one that I imagine I would be thanking. It's not the kind of God in which I put my faith. At the same time, I doubt that I would declare to Wolf that I'm an atheist because, well, I'm not, at least not without some explanation. So, given enough time, the camera's rolling, I might say something like, "Well, Wolf, that's a very interesting question." When you ask it, are you implying that I should be thanking a God who destroyed much of my town and oversaw the deaths of my neighbors because he or she decided to save me and my family? Well, I don't think that kind of God should be thanked right now. But if in your question you are using "thank the Lord" as a catch-all phrase to inquire if I am a person who is grateful to be alive for another day of mystery and possibility, another day of trying to live in such a way that a God of love and justice, if there were one, would be pleased, then I might be able to say yes, but I've really got to think about it some more. You see, Wolf, I'm agnostic. I don't think we can fully know who we are or even why we're here. To assume that there is a supernatural force guiding or even ignoring us is disconcerting to me because, given what I can observe, this kind of God would be too indiscriminately cruel to be thanked. Ever. I acknowledge that this kind of God is possible, but I have to think it's unlikely. Therefore, I don't live my life in service to this God or even in fear of it, and I certainly wouldn't be praising it right now. And yet, I am not without a sense of faith in things beyond myself, a sense of faith, for example, that this storm and its aftermath, even in all of the destruction and despair it has brought to our town, may lead us to know each other differently, to grow our relationships, to give ourselves, to understand that we are greater together than we could ever be on our own. A sense of faith that there is a force, an impulse, a biological predisposition in us, perhaps, that, given space and encouragement, can lead us to increase our love and our compassion for our neighbors and for the betterment of this world we share. I sometimes call this force spirit of life, or that which is greater than all but present in each. But I admit I don't know exactly what these phrases mean. I figure they will mean different things to different people, which I suppose is my intention, especially in my UU congregation, where I serve atheists, theists, and agnostics, and stand with them as they are called in their differences to be open to life, expecting to love, prepared to serve. I offer words like spirit of life with the expectation that they can be translated many different ways, because definitive answers on speculative questions are not within our grasp. At least I don't think so. I use these words as placeholders for that which is yet unknown to me, even beyond my own intuition and lived experience. This kind of God, or spirit of life, if you will, I can thank in a metaphorical way, and I often do. As in, thank you, all that I don't yet comprehend or understand, for the privilege it is to be alive, to laugh, to cry, to feel, to love, to learn, to grow, to become, even to die. Thank you, impulse that leads me to embrace life in all of its pain, all of its beauty and its mystery. Impulse that encourages me to reach out to my neighbors, seeing my destiny linked with theirs and the destiny of this planet that we share. I'm sure some wolf wouldn't call this homage to all that I don't yet comprehend or understand faith, but I do, because when I give myself to it, I find I am more open to difference, more open to what I can learn from my neighbors, more open to how other people make sense of this life, how their commitments and understandings can help me grow and refine mine in pursuit of a more just and loving and connected world. This kind of faith requires a reverence for my companions and for this life that we share. I often come up short in my attempts to embrace what I would call the holy possibilities of humble encounter, but I am committed to the importance of trying, for therein lies my faith. I'm sure by now the cameras had shut off. They've moved on to another story, right? Just going on and on and on. But if the camera's still on me, in my attempt to wrap up my rambling answer to Wolf's question, I could see myself ending in much the same way that young mother did. I'm an agnostic, Wolf, I would say, but I'm a reverent agnostic. So, of course, I don't blame anyone for thanking the Lord. Now, the cynical among us might say that an atheist or an agnostic answering that question by throwing in a comment about being okay with others thanking the Lord, well, they're just using that as a self-preservation tactic. And they may be right. In a country where admitting you are an atheist, or an agnostic for that matter, can leave you open to the fury of believers who will flag you as worthy of suspicion, if not ridicule, even discrimination, backpedaling a bit on your own godless truth can be an effective way to get you out of a non-persuasive and therefore pointless confrontation. If you are an atheist or you lean that way, you have probably been approached, if not accosted, by folks who think they're doing you a favor by pointing out the errors of your lack of traditional belief. How much have these folks, no matter how well-meaning or kind in their approach, altered your thinking? Not much, I'll bet. You know, it goes the other way, too, in that triumphal atheists rarely convert the more traditionally faithful among us. As I see it, conversations about theological concepts over which none of us can be certain can be so burdened with definitive assertions of right and wrong that they quickly devolve into tedious, self-righteous, and counterproductive attempts at conversion rather than conversation. When it comes to religion, it seems one person's reason is often another person's lunacy. Always has been, likely always will be. Given these differences, how can we stay in relationship with each other in service to the spirit of life toward which my reverent agnosticism points? How can we stay in relationship? It's not easy, that's for sure. A while back, when I offered a sermon that suggested the least helpful conversation is one in which the participants try to prove who is right theologically, a friend wrote to disagree with me. He said, "We religious liberals are too accommodating of those with exclusionary beliefs, especially when we say that everyone has a right to believe whatever she wants about God." He wanted to know why religious views are so often not up for discussion, why we bother with interfaith dialogue if we can't really get down into the nitty-gritty of our differences. The differences that, at their core, can represent dangerously varied worldviews and expectations about what life means and is worth. My friend shared his belief system causes him to feel a need to change the belief systems of others. He cited as examples his need to change the beliefs of those who believe homosexuality is a sin and who therefore feel they are justified in restricting the rights of gays and lesbians, and those who believe that an embryo is a person and therefore work to prohibit stem cell research. I understand his desire to change beliefs, I really do. I wish I could. It would certainly make things a lot easier, and I'm sure the fundamentalists of all stripes feel the same way. However, the question I offer to any of us who are working to change the religious belief system of others is, how is that working for you? How many fundamentalists have you converted to your truth? I suggest that trying to convince people that their theology is wrong, it's not a very good strategy. How many times has it worked when someone's tried it on you? I'm reminded of a story I like that shows the folly of such attempts. Happened in a town not all that different from ours. There's this elderly woman who every morning for years has gone out onto her porch, raised her arms to the sky, shouted, "Praise God." One day an atheist moves in next door to the woman and sees her morning ritual. He's irritated. So every morning he waits for the woman to shout her praises, "Praise God," so that he can shout back at her, "There is no God." This daily exchange goes on for years. One winter, though, the woman experiences some hardships in her life, and this time she adds a little bit more to her praise. She goes out onto her porch to holler, "Praise God," and then she continues, "I spent the food money on heat, and now I'm going hungry. Provide for me, God." The next morning, she steps out onto her porch and discovers 2 full bags of groceries at her front door. "Praise God," she proclaims. "God has provided me with groceries." Just then, the atheist neighbor jumps out and shouts back, "There is no God. I bought those groceries." The woman throws her arms in the air and shouts, "Praise God who provided me with groceries and made the devil pay for them." The moral of the story is clear. I'm guessing it's familiar in our own lived experience. No matter what is said to convince those who are predisposed to not agree with our speculative truths, chances are good our attempts will just further entrench the differences between us. American Buddhist nun Pema Chodron tells a story of how she fell into the trap of needing to be right about something speculative and how she got out of it. She writes, "The other night, I was getting hard-hearted, closed-minded, and fundamentalist about somebody else. And I remembered this expression that you can never hate somebody if you stand in that person's shoes. I was angry at him because he was holding such a rigid view. In that instant, I was able to put myself in his shoes, and I realized, hey, I'm just as riled up and self-righteous and closed-minded about this as he is. We're in exactly the same place. And I saw the more I held on to my view, the more polarized we would become, the more we'd just be mirror images of one another, 2 people with closed minds and hard hearts who both think they're right, screaming at each other. It changed for me when I saw it from his side, and I was able to see my own aggression, my own ridiculousness. If you could have a bird's eye perspective on the earth and could look down at all the conflicts that are happening, she writes, all you'd see are two sides to a story where both sides think they're right. So the solutions have to come from a change of heart, from softening what is rigid in our hearts and minds. In a recent reflection in our denominational magazine, the UU World, our UUA president, Peter Morales, points with optimism to the news that more and more people in the developed world at least seem to be moving away from religious exceptionalism, which he explains is the conviction that their religion possesses the truth, and by extension, every other religion is false. This kind of religious exceptionalism is being replaced, he says, by what we might call a softening, a growing appreciation for what we can share even across the lines that divide us. Common core values of the world's religious traditions, such as compassion, community, the pursuit of higher consciousness, are becoming more important than differences in our specific sectarian beliefs. As a reverent agnostic, I share his optimism about the emergence of a kind of faith beyond belief, as he calls it. Faith beyond belief, because I've seen the impact that this kind of faith has had in my own life. You know, I've had many meaningful encounters in my work as a ministry in the ministry over the years with clergy and with lay people from other faith traditions. People who have shared with me the commitments of their faith, not only through their words and their rituals, but perhaps more importantly, through the way they live their lives, through their actions in the community. For example, there are 3 pastors whom I've worked with most closely on Project Iowa, the workforce development initiative I currently serve as board chair. And they are significantly different from me in their theology. I've worked with a Seventh-day Adventist, a non-denominational Pentecostal, and an African Methodist Episcopal. As we've gotten to know each other, we've shared a few details of our theologies, but mostly we focused on the work we have in common rather than on our differences. Along these lines, I remember the first one-to-one meeting I had with one of these pastors. I sensed he might not be on the same page with my very public stance on marriage equality. So when we sat down together, I brought it up. I said, you know, we may have different views on marriage equality, but that's not a subject that Amos is working on right now, so I don't want it to come between us. We have other important work to do together. He agreed, and our differences on marriage equality have not been an issue for us. Meanwhile, we have done important work together, work that I'm proud of, work that has had an impact on our community, and I count him as a friend. If I were in trouble, he would be a person I would call. I've been inspired by him and by the other pastors with which I've worked, the way they live out their different faiths, though I don't see myself ever adopting their particular theologies. Knowing them, you see, has actually strengthened my own faith because they have taught me, yet again, how different views of the holy can lead people to contribute to the creation of a better world. And they have inspired me to live my own commitments in a more generous and open-hearted way. My experiences with them remind me of something a member of this church told our congregation more than a decade ago. I remember it well. He was reflecting in a moment of testimony about what he had learned through his work with Amos. That's the community organizing effort that we're a part of, along with about 30 other congregations in town. He said his words have stayed with me because they echo the same discovery that many of us have made in this interfaith work for justice. He said, I used to think that Christians were good people despite their faith. Now I know they're good people because of their faith. Not long ago, I came across a quote from a guy named Henry Slonimsky. Hope I said his name right. I don't really know his work very well. He's a Jewish writer and philosopher. I don't know where I saw the quote. It's taken out of context, but so sorry, Henry, if I missed the boat on this, but I think the quote sums up what I have learned in my interfaith encounters and in my commitment to my reverent agnostic faith. He wrote, religion is a momentous possibility. The possibility, namely, that what is highest in spirit is also deepest in nature, that there is something at the heart of nature, something akin to us, a conserver and increaser of values, that the things that matter most, he says, are not at the mercy of the things that matter least. I love that. The things that matter most are not at the mercy of the things that matter least. Now, to me, what matters least is the wrangling we do over whose terminology and metaphors are the right ones. And what matters most is the impact our differing faiths can lead us to have on bringing about a world where more community is grown, where more justice is pursued, and where more peace is made real more often. What matters most can be shared by people of various theologies, atheists, theists alike, and this kind of religion that might arise as a result would be a momentous possibility indeed. UU minister Marilyn Sewell sees this momentous possibility and the role each of us could play in bringing it to life, but she counsels us to be wary of the usual distractions and follies of our Unitarian Universalist approach. She says, "It's grown-up time now. We no longer prioritize how religious our language should be or conflicts between humanists and the more spiritually inclined. The mission of the church," she says, "is not to meet our needs. The mission of the church is to help heal our world. It is to give ourselves to something larger than ourselves." I contend that that something larger doesn't have to require God, but I think it should be hospitable to those who find meaning in notions of the divine. It has to leave space for difference. And that's why, for me, it has to focus less on what we don't know and more on what we do. Less on what we will never fully understand and more on what we can create together. Here's an example of what I'm talking about. The very same day that Wolf Blitzer interviewed that young mother, a man named Juan Menendez, he's a state representative from Arizona, offered an invocation for his colleagues in the Arizona House, an invocation that fits well into a religion of momentous possibility. I'm going to share this invocation. He didn't call it a prayer. He's a secular humanist. But I want you to get your mind around what this would be like here in this Arizona house, right? He said, "Most prayers in this room begin with a request to bow your heads. I would like to ask you to not bow your heads. I would like to ask you to take a moment to look around the room at all of the men and women here in this moment, sharing together the extraordinary experience of being alive and of dedicating ourselves to working toward improving the lives of people in our state. This is a room in which there are many challenging debates, many moments of tension, of ideological division, of frustration. But this is also a room where, as my secular humanist tradition stresses, by the very fact of being human, we have much more in common than we have differences. We share the same spectrum of potential for care, for compassion, for fear, for joy, for love. Carl Sagan once wrote, "For small creatures such as we, the vastness is bearable only through love." There is, in the political process, much to bear. In this room, let us cherish and celebrate our shared humanness, our shared capacity for reason and compassion, our shared love for the people of our state, for our Constitution, for our democracy. Let us root our policy-making process in these values that are relevant to all Arizonans, regardless of religious belief or non-belief. In gratitude and in love, in reason and in compassion, let us work together for a better Arizona. In that invocation, he didn't put his own religious views or lack thereof above those of others. He claimed them, but he didn't spend time saying people were wrong. He pointed people to a different vision. He invited his colleagues into the work that they shared, pointing out their similarities rather than their differences. Now, he may not call this perspective faith, but I do. And it's similar to the faith that I claim for myself. It's a faith that is not dependent upon God, but it doesn't deny the power that notions of God may have in the lives of my neighbors. A faith that is open and curious and respectful of difference, or at least it tries to be. A faith that admits me to fleeting union with the greater. A faith that leads me to be at home, living warm and friendly with my fellows in the starry world. In his poem, Self-Portrait, David White eloquently captures the same spirit that I want my reverent agnosticism to have. A spirit of life that transcends our differences and invites us into relationship and all that we can together become. Feels like a prayer to me. He writes, "It doesn't interest me if there is one God or many gods. I want to know if you belong or feel abandoned, if you know despair or can see it in others. I want to know if you are prepared to live in the world with its harsh need to change you, if you can look back with firm eyes saying, 'This is where I stand.' I want to know if you know how to melt into that fierce heat of living, falling toward the center of your longing. I want to know if you are willing to live day by day with the consequence of love and the bitter, unwanted passion of your sure defeat. I have been told in that fierce embrace, even the gods speak of God." A momentous possibility indeed.